Trend lines are perhaps the simplest of the tools we use in the technical arsenal, and are arguably one of the most effective. Since the construction of nearly all price patterns requires the use of trend lines, this concept is a fundamental building block of pattern identification and interpretation. It also has great value in momentum work, but more of this later. In this module, I'll describe their characteristics and explain how the significance of individual lines can be determined.
A trend line is a straight line connecting a series of ascending bottoms in a rising market, or the tops of a descending series of rally peaks. Those joining the lows are called uptrend lines, and those connecting the tops are referred to as downtrend lines. Typically, a downtrend line is constructed by joining the final peak with the top of the first rally, as in this example. When the price breaks above the trend line, a trend change signal is given. In order for a line to be a true trend line, it must connect two or more peaks or troughs. Otherwise, it's going to be drawn in space and will have no significance. You'll often see people constructing lines that only touch one point, as we see here. It's just not valid. This one doesn't touch any points at all. Such lines also have no meaning whatsoever, and are really worse than drawing nothing at all. That's because they give the casual observer the impression that they actually do have some significance by the very fact of simply appearing on the chart. It's a fundamentally important point because a true trend line is a graphic way of representing the underlying trend. Consequently, if it only touches one point or less, it cannot be a true trend line. It's actually more than that, because a trend line is nothing more than a dynamic level of support and resistance. Dynamic means that, say, the support level reflected by the line is continually changing its level, unlike the support and resistance levels we considered before, which were at set horizontal levels. Violating an uptrend line is therefore like violating a support zone, and vice versa. Ideally, an uptrend line is constructed by connecting the final low with the first bottom in the rally, just like this. It's called a primary trend line. In the case of a primary trend, this will be the bear market low and the first intermediate bottom. The example shown here offers a fairly sharp angle of ascent, which means that the line is soon violated. In such situations, it's better to redraw the line as the price moves up. It is obviously a better reflection of the underlying trend, and that is precisely what we're after. This is called a secondary trend line. Since trends can be sideways, it also follows that trend lines can be drawn horizontally. It's also important to understand at this point that drawing trend lines is more a matter of common sense rather than following a set of hard and fast rules. A valid trend line break results in a change of trend, either a reversal or a trading range. In this example, the trend line violation results in a reversal as the trend changes to a downward one. Here the result is different, as the line is penetrated and the price action that follows is a trading range. In this instance, the downtrend line break is followed by a reversal. But for this one, it's a consolidation, which is later followed by a breakout to the upside. These brown lines are, of course, also trend lines, and are just as valid as potential support resistance zones. In most instances, there is unfortunately no way of telling at the time of the violation which possibility will prove to be the outcome. One clue may be provided by the trend line's angle of ascent or descent, since sharp-angled trend lines like this one are less sustainable, so their penetration has a tendency to be followed by a consolidation rather than a reversal. Most people observe the violation of a trend line and assume that the trend has changed, eventually forgetting completely about the line. But this is a mistake, because an extended line can become just as important as the pre-violated line itself. If an uptrend line is violated, for instance, the price often returns to the extended line. This is known as a throwback move. Here we see a trend line reversing its previous role as support, while the throwback move turns it into an area of resistance. Here's the reverse set of circumstances in a declining market, where a downtrend line is violated and its extended part reverses its resistance role to one of support. This chart shows an uptrend line break for Home Depot that acted as support but reversed its role to resistance after its violation. Then we see the opposite as a resistance downtrend line becomes support in its phase as an extended line. Trend lines have measuring implications when they're broken. The measurement is the maximum vertical distance between the price and the trend line, and that is projected in the direction of the breakout. An example for a rising trend is shown in this example. This is the maximum distance, which is then projected down at the point of break. The term price objective is perhaps misleading. Objectives are usually reached when a trendline violation turns out to be a reversal, but because they are more often exceeded, the objective becomes more of a minimum expectation. An upside objective for a downside reversal would be done by calculating the maximum distance between the price and the line just here, and then projecting it to the upside. As you can see, it doesn't have to happen in one move. So far, only the possibilities of drawing trend lines joining bottoms in rising markets and tops in declining ones have been examined. It's also useful to draw lines that are parallel to those basic trend lines, as shown here. In a rising market, the parallel line, known as a return trend line, joins the tops of the rallies. During declines, the return line joins a series of bottoms, as we see here. In both cases, the area between these trend extremities is known as a trend channel. The return line is useful from 2 points of view. First, it represents an area of support or resistance, depending on the direction of the trend. Second, and perhaps more important, penetration of the return trend line represents a signal that the trend will accelerate. On the other hand, if the angle of the trend channel is much steeper and the price temporarily violates the return line, its violation represents an exhaustion move. That is one in which the buyers run out of steam. The failure of the price to hold above the return line then signals an important reversal in trend. You can see such an example with the value line arithmetic index in this chart. Here's the basic uptrend line, then the return line. Note how the exhaustion move is not only followed by a decline to the trend line, but eventually well beyond it. Exhaustion also develops when a price rallies temporarily above a regular downtrend line, and then breaks back below it. In the case of a downtrend line, the situation is akin to someone jumping up and temporarily pushing himself through the ceiling. He's able to pull his head through to the next floor for a few moments, and then falls sharply back to the floor below. At this point, he's used up all his spare energy in an attempt to move to the next floor, and is totally exhausted. To make another attempt will take some time as he regains some new energy. The same is true of the price, which makes an effort to rally above the trend line, but it's unable to maintain the breakout. This temporary break often indicates that the prevailing trend has much further to run. It also raises a dilemma in the way in which a trend line should be constructed. In this example, for instance, we see a false break above trendline AB. Should AB now be abandoned, or should the peak of the exhaustion break be connected to the rally high to form a new trend line? Again, it's a matter of common sense. On the one hand, the whipsaw break is technically the correct place to draw the line, but common sense suggests that the original line is a better reflection of the underlying trend. After all, at the time of the whipsaw, it had been touched 3 times. If the line is then drawn to reflect the break, it will only have been touched twice, once at the outset and once on the whipsaw break. In a sense, the whipsaw is adding further credibility to the initial line because the price was unable to hold above it. If we'd come upon this situation after the whipsaw break and tried to construct a line, it would have been even more obvious that line AB was far superior to line AC, because it had been touched or approached on far more occasions. When you think about it, a whipsaw break actually adds credibility to the trend line. That's because the price is able to violate the line, but because it's so significant as a support resistance area, the price is unable to hold that break. If it was not such a significant barrier, the break would have held and the whipsaw avoided. Consequently, when the price is able to experience a valid break, the signal is that much stronger. One other rule I have is that whenever you see a false or misleading signal, namely a whipsaw, be prepared for an above average move in the opposite direction to the whipsaw. Just remember, if you can get on the right side of a whipsaw, you're probably being presented with a great trading opportunity. The significance of a trend line depends on 3 factors. 1, the length of the line. The longer the line, the greater the trend being monitored, and therefore the greater the significance. Just remember, big trends result in big signals, small trends in small ones. This one features an hourly chart of the dollar index. Note how the ensuing rally lasted for about 36 hours. This chart takes us to the other extreme, with a 40-year trend line for the Nikkei, being followed by a 30-year consolidation. There's another one you might want to look out for, and that's this 20-year special, which in mid-2011 was around 17,000. This is actually a much better line. 2. The number of times a trend line has been touched or approached. A trend line derives its authority from the number of times it's been touched or approached. The larger the number, the greater the significance. This is true because a trend line represents a dynamic area of support and resistance. Each test of the line contributes to the importance of this support-resistance zone, and thus the authority of the line is a true reflection of the underlying trend. Just remember that a close encounter to the line or an approach is almost as important as an actual touching, because it still reflects the line's importance as a support or resistance area. Here we see a nice line for United Technologies. That's because it's quite long and it's been touched or approached on numerous occasions. Don't forget that if a line gains significance from the fact that it's been touched or approached on numerous occasions, the extended line will become equally as important, but from a reverse point of view. 3. Angle of ascent or descent. All trends are eventually violated, but the steeper ones are likely to be ruptured more quickly. The violation of a particularly steep trend line is not as significant as that of a more gradual one. Penetration of a steep line usually results in a short corrective movement, following which the trend resumes, but at a greatly reduced and more sustainable pace. Usually the penetration of a steep trend line represents a continuation rather than a reversal break. Trend line summary. 1. Trend lines are an easy tool to understand, but should be used with a strong dose of common sense. Considerable experimentation and practice are required before the art of interpreting them can be successfully mastered. 2. Trend line violations either signal a temporary interruption or a reversal in the prevailing trend. It's necessary to refer to other pieces of technical evidence to determine which it might be. 3. The significance of trend lines is a function of their length, the number of times they've been touched or approached, and the steepness of the angle of ascent or descent. 4. A good trend line reflects the underlying trend and represents an important support and resistance zone. 5. Extended trend lines reverse the former support-resistance role and should not be overlooked. 6. Exhaustion breaks are usually followed by sharp moves in the opposite direction to the break. They enhance the significance of a trend line.